April 20th, 2020, Lake Washington School Board meeting. I believe this is now our 4th virtual meeting. Maybe it's only our 3rd, but we are getting better at it. So please let the record reflect that all 5 board members are present and participating remotely. All meeting participants will also be joining this meeting remotely in alignment with current proclamation issued by Governor Inslee. And the board meeting will be live streamed and viewable on the district website. And if you are unable to live stream the meeting, viewers can call 425-936-2805 or 425-936-2809, conference ID 471683, to listen to the meeting. So regular board meetings will continue to be live streamed on the Lake Washington School District website and posted for viewing within 2 days, as long as district staff are available to support basic functions of our board meetings. Please note there will be no in-person public comments to ensure social distancing, and all public comments should be submitted in writing to Diane Jenkins by 1 p.m. on the day of the board meeting. More information can be found on our website. And these same procedures will be used for all of our board meetings scheduled in April. So with that, I will now entertain a motion to approve the April 20th agenda.
Move approval. Second.
It has been moved by Director Carlson and seconded by Director Stewart that we approve the agenda. All those in favor, please signify by voting aye.
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 Anyone opposed? Hearing none, agenda passes. All right, so for this evening, our next item on the agenda is public comment, and this evening we have not received any, so we will be moving on to our next item. The next item is our consent agenda, and so I will entertain a motion to approve the consent agenda.
So moved.
Second. It has been moved by Director LaLiberty and seconded by Director Sage to approve the consent agenda. Dr. Stabum, could you please poll the board?
Yes. President Bleasner?
Yes.
Director Stewart?
Yes.
Director Carlson?
Yes.
Director Sage?
Yes.
Director LaLiberty?
Yes.
Excellent, thank you. And with that, we still have donations on the consent agenda, and if you could just provide us a summary of those. Even with schools closed, we are still continuing to receive support from our community.
We are, and that amount tonight is $1,325 from the Lake Washington Schools Foundation, from PTSA $8,685.64, and from private sources the amount of $2,690, with a total of $12,700.64 of very generous donations. And we know too that these are the ones that make it onto our agenda, but we also know that our community has been supporting our school district in many, many ways, and donations to a lot of organizations that are helping to feed people and support people while they are taking a temporary leave from employment, all kinds of different ways that our generous community has stepped up. So we appreciate all of those things as well.
Wonderful, thank you so much. So our next item is on the non-consent agenda. We have one item for this evening, and that is the Strategic Plan Connection. It's a legislative update. And so I will pass this to Dr. Stabum to introduce it as we go forward.
Yes, and Barbara Posthumus is going to give us an overview. So while she is getting ready to share her screen, I'll just share that we added this tonight just because there were some changes that came about from a first round of legislative changes, and then our governor has made some additional changes given the situation with COVID-19. And so we wanted to make sure that everybody was kind of on the same page with any of the changes that were made with vetoes and how that did or did not affect our school district. So with that, I can see your screen, Barbara, so I'm assuming everybody else can. So if you can just give us a brief update, that would be great.
Great. Well, thank you. And let me just make sure this is plain. So, yes, so we last provided the board, good evening, everyone. We last provided the board with an update during the legislative session. Here's the legislative calendar. We provided the board with an update on February 24th when the House and the Senate both released their budget proposals. So we haven't yet, and the session ended on March 12th. It feels like ages ago, but so the legislative session ended. We had a conference budget, so I want to share with you tonight the results of the final supplemental budget.
And Barbara, would you pause just for a minute? I want to make
Yep.
sure that everybody is able to see your screen. Is everybody able to now?
You're broadcasting just great.
Siri, are you able to see? Okay, great. All right, keep going,
Okay.
Barbara.
Thank you. So just as a reminder, the board developed its priorities in the fall of 2019. They were adopted at a November board meeting, and then we began meeting with local legislators in December and January. And our priorities were followed our strategic plan, and we had priorities in the academic success area, which is enhancements to special education program and services. We had priorities in well-being for social emotional learning, priorities, emphasis on school construction funding and simple majority for bonds, and then focusing on excellent staff, school employee benefit board. And you can see I've checked with a green check if our legislative priorities were actually addressed during this supplemental budget. And then you can see the majority have a red X next to them because they weren't really addressed in this supplemental budget. So first, to talk about our academic success areas and special education programs and services, the final legislative budget did provide a two-tier formula with a different an enhanced multiplier or funding rate for those students who spend 80% or more of time in a general education classroom versus those spending less than 80% in a general education classroom. So you can see that the tier 1 multiplier is now higher. It is increased from 0.9950 to 1.0075. And this provides approximately $200,000 in new revenue. And again, that isn't going to be money that we can do new things with. It's going to be needed to provide it for the actual costs that currently exceed our budget. So as we've discussed many times before, special education remains still woefully underfunded by the state.
So, sorry, naive question, Barbara.
Yep.
0.995 mean that tier 2 students actually are funded less than a general ed student, or is this 0.995 on top of 1 for a gen ed student?
So you get your gen ed funding first, and then you receive supplemental funding for a basic ed student, and that supplemental funding is 99% of the basic ed rate. So you get the basic ed rate plus the higher rate.
Right.
So you're getting more funding for those who, if you're spending less time in a general ed classroom.
Right. Okay, thank you.
The other thing that they did that was outside our legislative platform, but just in relation to special education, they transferred birth to 3 funding from school districts to the Department of Children, Youth, and Families. So that really is a revenue. They're going to reduce our revenue and transfer it to the Department of Children, Youth, and Families, but that also means we don't have to spend that money either. So we will lose a small amount, about $140,000 in lost overhead. The next area is well-being and social emotional learning. So unfortunately, we didn't get a lot of additional funds in this category. We asked for them to change the prototypical model to fund more school counselors, and they did. The supplemental budget did provide additional FTE at the elementary level, but it was for high poverty elementary schools only. So it did not benefit Lake Washington School District because we do not have any schools with this over 50% poverty level. And the other thing, just to point out, you see the big red veto there is that due to the economic impact of the stay-at-home order, on April 3rd, the governor trimmed $235 million from the state budget. And so he did that by vetoing certain sections of the budget, and this was one area he vetoed. So while in March, the legislature added the 0.5 counselor for high poverty schools, in April, that was vetoed. So that additional funding will not happen. And again, we would not have benefited from that anyway. We also asked in our legislative platform to provide pilot programs to promote social emotional learning. There was nothing in the conference budget to do that. They, however, did provide 1.5 FTE at each educational service district for regional mental health coordination, a school safety center. So there's funding for at our ESDs that we are able to access. So the next area is under effective use of resources, and our legislative platform focused on two areas: school construction funding and simple majority for school bonds. And neither of one of these were addressed in the supplemental budget. They did update the state formula for school construction. Sorry, we asked them to update this formula for school construction funding assistance. And again, that did not happen. We also have been pushing for a simple majority passage of school bonds. So instead of the 60% needed to pass a bond, to eliminate that and treat it like a levy at a 50% requirement, and that did not happen in this legislative session. So we'll certainly be working on that in the next legislative session. So the other area is excellent staff, and our focus was on the School Employee Benefits Board and making sure that they provided adequate funding for the cost of SEB. If you recall, we're estimating a $4 million local impact due to the implementation of SEB. Because that started in January, we won't have a full year of implementation until next year, so the total cost of that is still unknown. So that, again, nothing changed with funding for SEB, so that did not happen. However, in the supplemental budget, they did provide additional funds for paraeducator training. If you recall, this year, in 2019-20, they added a requirement of 14 hours to train all our current and newly hired employees, and they will provide a reimbursement for that, for not all the costs, but some of the costs. They'll fund that reimbursement after the school year is over. The supplemental budget for next year actually increased the requirement to 4 days or 28 hours of training. That was another area that was vetoed. The governor vetoed that in April due to in order to save state money. Just a reminder on how that paraeducator training works is, even though they vetoed that section, is all our paraeducators this year, and we have about 700 employees that are receiving 14 hours of training. Next year, all the new staff that we hire will receive 2 days of those 14 hours of training, and current staff will still get another 2 days of training. So if you were a staff member hired this year, you're getting your 14 hours this year, and if you're continuing on, you'll get another 14 hours the next year. So the new staff will only get the 14 hours. And we are on track, even with our school closures for the current school year. We're on track for all of our paras to complete the required 14 hours of training this year. The training is spread over the whole school year, and they are continuing to do that training online remotely. So the other area is professional learning of funding is professional learning days. The final budget did include the planned increase from 1 to 2 professional days for teachers. And I'm sorry, they actually increased from 2 to 3 days in 2021. And then there is new language in the professional learning days that requires 1 of the 3 days to be focused on cultural and racial equity training. So the other impact for staff as in our staffing area is the legislative compensation impacts. The state funded a 1.6 inflationary adjustment, or IPD. They did increase the SEB premium slightly. It was an average of $997 this year. Now it will be $1,000 a month next year. And there's a very small increase in pension rates. So lastly, I wanted to provide you with a bill summary. When we shared back in February, we were watching over 15 bills, and I just wanted to give you the status of these are the bills that actually passed. And so we have 5 bills. We have 1191, which is just changes to notification requirements for students that have committed certain crimes, and those notifications aren't subject to the Public Records Act. A bill related to ASB activities passed, and it requires districts to have an opportunity gap plan and policy for waiving fees for low-income students. This is another unfunded mandate in the sense that there's a lot of data and tracking of data that we have to report without any additional funding to do that. The other bill that we didn't mention in February is Senate Bill 5395 related to sexual health education. And that requires public schools to provide comprehensive sexual health education, which we already do, but it emphasizes including healthy relationships, attitudes, and discussing affirmative consent. And it requires OSPI to develop instructional materials. For that, we'll have minor adjustments to our grade 4 through 12 instructional materials, and there'll be a larger impact to K3 materials for that bill. The next bill is 6066, ethnic study materials, and that section of the budget was actually vetoed in April, so that won't go through. And then the last bill was 6521, which provides funding for a innovative learning pilot for students participating in a mastery-based learning program. So that concludes my update on kind of the impact of the legislative session. We'll be talking with the board more in May on total budget, the budget outlook for next year.
Thank you, Barbara.
Any questions?
I have a quick question. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh, okay, sorry. On the sexual health education, I understand there's different curriculums we can choose from as long as they are comprehensive.
And I would ask us to hold that question, just because we aren't prepared for a more extensive discussion on each of the different things. So if we can table that question, that would be great. And then we'll have a presentation on that specifically where Mike and Jen can provide kind of a more in-depth look at that. We want to just keep this to our agenda topic of the legislative update.
So what we can do is plan to have that as a future agenda item, and we'll look through that when we meet this week in which to look at those things. That work, Director Sage?
Yes, thank you.
We can also do a board brief on just what the changes mean compared to what we have right now, and we can put that in that format first, even in front of a presentation, if that would be okay too.
Both sounds great.
All right, thanks.
Thank you.
So thank you very much. I think the additional paraeducator training is fabulous that that's come through. Recognize that these movements in the legislature will have impacts, and there'll be more to come as the coronavirus outbreak plays out and its impacts. Any other questions in regards to the legislative?
Yes.
Okay, Director Stewart?
I understood that there's supposed to be some new direction coming out of OSPI this afternoon. Have we received that?
On what topic, Mark?
OSPI update regarding grading. I thought it was supposed to be.
Mike's going to talk in just a minute about what we do know at this point under my superintendent's report. We have not seen, at least I have not seen it yet, what we were waiting for in terms of more complete guidance. Chris Rakedahl put out his Friday update with some information in there, but not very specific to that. It was just more some overview. So I'll let Mike update us in just a minute here, but not that I'm aware of. I could be wrong.
Okay. Waz's call earlier today, it said they were supposed to have something this afternoon, but heaven knows that could be delayed.
Well, we were expecting it actually by last Friday, but we had not received it as of the weekend.
Okay, thank you.
You bet.
Any other questions? Hearing none, then I would like to say thank you for providing that update. Appreciate it, sort of walking through the legislative platform as well and having an idea as to how those all fell out. So appreciate your taking the time to do that and providing that, and looking forward to how this starts to play out in the future. So with that, our next item on the agenda is the superintendent report.
Yes.
And so I will pass it off to you again, Dr. Stable.
Thank you. So today was the first day of kind of moving things up in terms of some rigor and kind of kicking things up a notch with our online remote learning plan. And so we wanted to give you an update with that, as well as around a few of the things that have been developing around the waiver process, what we do know about grades, what we don't know about grades. And before I ask Mike to take the microphone, the other piece, of course, that people are wondering about that we're working on is graduation. So last week, our superintendent did not. Our principals met with Dale Cody and Matt Livingston, our level directors, to start that conversation and talk about the process that we would use to look at what our options could be for graduation. And so they are taking some next steps and just finding out what neighboring districts might be doing, districts within our state, what's feasible and not feasible in terms of venue and caps and gowns and just kind of everything that we know or don't know at this point. They're also going to be talking with some students, and then what we're going to do is put together a survey that will go out to seniors. And rather than just throwing it out there kind of wide open, what do you want? We thought it would be good to have some specific things for them to respond to and narrow it in just a little bit before we put that out. And so that's what people are busy working on this week, so that then we can really start to think about what's feasible and what do kids want to do. And then we'll bring that to the board as an update when we get a little closer to what we think will work for our high school seniors. It's been really interesting. I know you've seen many of the articles and ideas that are out there, and you see things posted online. And, it makes a big difference if you have 400 seniors in a class or if you have 40 seniors in a class, and if you have multiple high schools or one high school or venues in your community. So it's interesting just to look at how school districts across the country are solving the graduation dilemma. And I've read a couple of articles over the weekend that students have written, and just the difference of how kids even feel about this, but they all are feeling it in some way, missing that big milestone. I think one of the disadvantages when you become an adult is you lose what it was like to feel things as a kid. And I was trying to go back and just think about the anticipation of those things, and things like prom and different milestone events that we associate with our high schools, and just think about what leads up to that and what you dream about, and then to have that taken away and not be able to do those things. I'm not able to imagine that far, because I'm not a high school senior, but I know we want to do our very best to help them have something memorable that fills that gap as much as we can. So with that, part of that work is the work that Mike Van Orden and legions of people have been working on in terms of helping our kids get prepared for graduation and to finish out this year successfully. And there are a lot of things that go into that. And still some debate out there about grading, and you're seeing different things posted about what districts are thinking about in terms of grades. And so Mike, if you would give us an update on where we are currently with anything regarding the steps that we need to take to make sure that our students are ready to first graduate and second to complete the year, and have work that is valued in one way or the other, so that they are continuing to learn and we're acknowledging what they are doing as learners.
Yeah, and it looks like I'm trying to share my screen. Can folks see it, or is it we're back in the?
I can see it.
Okay, you can see the PowerPoint presentation.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, there we go. So tonight we wanted to give you some updates on a few areas that are starting to stand out. First of all, did, as you know, have a field test with a number of teachers that happened last week. And we actually learned quite a bit from that will give us some indication of what to expect this week as the majority of our teachers are moving on. So I'm going to share with you just some highlights from that, including just some high-level responses from some of our surveys we did with families and staff. We also want to talk about waiver options for seniors. As you may recall, the State Board of Education came out with an emergency waiver process specifically for seniors to waive core course requirements. And so we'll talk through where we are in that process and what the implications are. There was also some guidance from Washington School Directors Association around competency credit, and thinking about some options for that, particularly again for seniors that we can check in on. I can give you an update on grading and reporting, and finally, the ways we're thinking of tracking attendance and connection, and Matt Gillingham may be able to chime in on that a little bit as well. So to start, I wanted to give you a high-level overview of the field test we did last week. As you recall, we had about 165 teachers that started in an early rollout of graded curriculum-based learning, and we did that for a couple reasons. One is we knew that some teachers were ready to go and were able to deliver sooner than later, and we wanted to honor and acknowledge that. At the same time, we also wanted to gather some information from them about their experiences so that we could apply that to other teachers and to our longer-term planning. So we had, as I mentioned, about 164 teachers. They were willing and prepared to deliver, and so they started for the most part last week. We also looked at feedback in two specific areas. So one was from teachers and one was from families. As far as teachers, we asked a number of questions and actually had a pretty extensive survey that we gave to teachers that asked in the areas of student participation and engagement. So what percentage of the students were connecting with what they were teaching? Quite a few questions on our digital tools, not only the tools that they use, but the quality of the experience that they had with those tools. We asked some questions about adjustments and accommodations for students with disabilities and those who speak English as a second language, and actually asked them what they were doing so that we could share that information with our directors, but also our schools. We asked about assessment and grading, and then finally we asked for overall feedback and advice for other teachers. For the family survey, it was more condensed, recognizing that our families don't have an hour to take a survey, but we do want to get some information from them. So we asked some questions about overall satisfaction with remote instruction last week, satisfaction with the resources and content that they were working with, information about student time, how much time they were engaged, and that'll be important, particularly as we ask both teachers and families that question to see how the perception of how much time students are spending matches up with what families are reporting. Satisfaction with that time, barriers to access, and then we asked them to give us an example of a success and a challenge they experienced. And we asked families that had high school students interest about some possible options for grading. So what I wanted to share with you again was just a few of the results that were interesting. There's quite a bit more underneath these that we're disaggregating and pulling out by grade level and using for planning. But specifically for staff, we thought it was interesting just to look at what percentage of their students were actually participating last week when they said it became kind of more of a formal remote learning. And so as you can see, the majority have had kids that were in that 60 to 100% of their students participating. So this was how many of your students were actually there showing up in some form. We're expecting this number to increase, but I think what we saw was that was an increase over the prior time when resources were optional and teachers were sharing with us that they were seeing very low participation. So we want to continue to increase those numbers and continue to have and ultimately have every student participating in some form or another. But again, this gives us some interesting baseline data. We also asked them what their primary tool that they were using to deliver lessons, just to kind of see how that broke down. And it was the majority were using Power School Learning. In spite of the fact that it was happening kind of slowly and there was some lag issues, we're hearing that was the case for learning management management systems across the board, not only ours, but Google and Schoology and some other platforms that are used by neighboring districts. A number of teachers are also using OneNote, and there was a small percentage that were using email as their primary delivery system. And so some of those we talked to where they had students that had specific needs, but some of them, that was their primary tool. And so that's going to be something we want to keep an eye on, because that's kind of the minimum standard for delivering remote instruction. We also put Teams up here because as we move to having Teams available and we gather more data on that use, we want to see if and how teachers are using that for remote instruction. Finally, we asked teachers to rank or kind of weigh in on how effective they thought the tool was itself. On a scale of 0, not at all, to 4, highly effective. And the weighted average for that was about a 4. So teachers were feeling like particularly PowerSchool and OneNote were serving the purpose in a lot of ways despite the lag issues that we were seeing. We also asked teachers, all the participating teachers, to give advice to staff members who were starting this week, and we captured that. We're actually going to pull that into categories, but we shared this advice with teachers out in the field on Friday to say, hey, here are some folks that have been out in front for about a week, and we wanted to share with you some of the sage advice that they have to you so that folks who are starting to plan can begin to read through this. There were a lot of really good pieces of information, including how to start, pacing, the expectation that teachers be patient because there are going to be some bumps along the way. So some real good information in there. And as I said, we're going to be disaggregating that. We also asked our families to weigh in, and we had about 1,500 or so individual responses. We asked families if they had more than one child to do a response for each child. So this represents about 1,500 students who are participating. We asked about overall experience, and again, if we look at the weighted average, it's about a 3.33. So 0, poor, 5, excellent. Kind of right in the middle right now for that first week of instruction. And as you can see, there are folks that were very dissatisfied and people that were saying it was a 5, it was excellent. So we're kind of hitting that interesting bulk in the center, and then we have some outlier, some 0s and 5s that we're going to have to attend to with our goal of moving everybody to improved expectations and improved remote learning. Interestingly, too, we asked about the resources they were using. So this would be the instructional materials, the digital tools, things like that. Slightly higher score there, weighted average of 3.5. So again, there's a range. Some folks didn't work at all, and some folks it did. But again, we're hitting kind of that middle mark. The other thing we're going to be able to do is disaggregate this by grade level and subject area. So ultimately, we can pull out and see, are we seeing higher numbers in certain grade levels or certain areas? So we're thinking that this will be something we want to continue to monitor every few weeks. Anyway, potentially from 2 to 4 weeks, we could do kind of check-ins to make sure we're continuing to make progress. We also asked about their sense of how they felt about the overall amount of learning. And again, about 50% said just right, and then you have some that say not enough and some that say too much. And so that's going to be one that we're going to have to keep an eye on, particularly as teachers think about flexibility with students. And the last thing, which we'll talk about a little more in the end, but we put this in as a question for families who had students who were high school students about the option of, if we were to go to a pass-fail system, how important would it be for you to have the option of requesting a letter grade? And so you can see here about 60% or so of our families said that was either somewhat important or very important. But again, some, about 120 in this case, said they prefer the option not be available or not at all important. So we're going to keep an eye on that as well, and we'll have some more information to share with you about grading. Finally, we asked about barriers. And again, there were more questions but these were some of the highlights that we were able to pull as a group. What were the barriers that you were experiencing? And again, about 50% said their children were not experiencing barriers, but pretty significant percentage or numbers said that motivation was still a challenge, even with a move to remote learning that was in some ways expected. Communication and directions continue to need to be tuned up. And then even though some of these others maybe have lower numbers, they're still important. So for example, support and supervision for students who have disabilities or who speak English as a second language, over 100 responses saying that was an area of concern. So this is good information as we begin to think about training for teachers. It's good information to think about as we prioritize guidance for teachers and how to help them do better jobs in these areas. And then again, these are areas that we can monitor to try to continue to remove barriers. So as we think about next steps for this work, as I mentioned, we gave advice directly to teachers from the field test. We're also seeing this as good baseline data and to compare teachers that were starting without a lot of guidance and a lot of support. How do their numbers look compared to when we've actually provided more training? We actually get teams going online, or do we start to see an uptick in some of those areas? And that tells us we're headed in the right direction. It'll also allow us to continue monitoring teacher and family perception data. And if we do that every, like I said, 2 to 3 weeks, we can see if we continue to move the mark. And if not, that gives us indications of things that we need to work on. That will allow us to prioritize training and identify additional guidance. So for right now, for example, I think we have a high need to work on how do we improve student motivation and clarity of communication, and we've already taken some steps in that way. Some training around some of our digital tools that can be put in our teacher professional learning management system, and then also some information around assessment and grading practices. In addition, we ask both families and teachers to identify barriers and challenges, and so we can start to clump those into large groups that will allow us to start working on some things that we can improve. And then finally, there were also some early successes, and we want to make sure we're continuing to highlight those. So we gathered quite a bit of good information, and as I mentioned, we want to continue to gather information like this from families and teachers as we still have about 9 weeks left, and I think that will help us to continue to make improvements. It'll also be helpful for us as we think about remote learning in the future. Whether we open or not, we see remote learning as a viable option for many kids, and so this information we gather during this time will be useful for us. So I can continue to move on. I could also take a stop here. Jane, do you have a preference on that?
Why don't we pause just for a minute, see if anybody has a question?
Mike?
Yep.
You mentioned some motivations, and you're working on some new ones too. Could you share some of the motivations? And one other thing before I forget it too. I had some comments today from some parents saying that their students on this first day seemed overwhelmed.
Yep.
And I didn't know how much feedback you were getting. I wonder if that's the kids that perhaps hadn't been doing a lot before that, or it's just the fact that all of a sudden, oh my God, it's real. I don't know.
Yeah, it's probably all of that, Mark, as far as the overwhelm. We heard a little bit of that when teachers started the field test, but then again, there might have been a student might have had one of their 7 teachers at the secondary level. And so, yeah, I think we need to be thoughtful of that. Also, the amount of communication. And as I mentioned, we've been really intentional about having all teachers use a common format that goes home each week. But there's been some questions about, does that all have to go at exactly the same time on Monday, or could it come earlier? And so we're going to work on that. But that is like a one-stop shop to say, okay, for the whole week, here's everything you need at a glance, and then you can link into more detailed information.
Okay.
Yeah,
and they can always email their teacher for clarifications if they're just kind of overwhelmed or confused, correct?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. That's what I suggest.
As far as the motivation, there's kind of 2 areas that we're looking at. One is just the types of learning that kids are being asked to do. So if it's all worksheets, if it's all kind of drills and practice without any kind of meaning or purpose to it, as when we have students in our classrooms, that doesn't seem typically as high, doesn't create as much motivation. So thinking about the quality of instruction, the types of tasks kids are asked to do, can they connect it to some things that they're experiencing right now in their lives? So we created at the elementary and secondary levels, guidance for teachers about remote instruction and pedagogy, we call it, teaching and learning, that will try to increase motivation for kids. The other thing, though, that's interesting is we're finding that as teachers are saying these are things that are being entered into a grade book or being accounted for, that's increasing the number of students who are participating too. And I know there's lots of philosophical debate around grading, but that does seem to be increasing the number of kids who are connecting. And then following that, we're going to need to continue to have teachers reaching out to families of students who are not connecting as much.
Yeah, I would just comment too, for everybody. I was going to say this at the end, but I'll say it now because it's related to your question, Mark, is I think it's been very hard for many districts to characterize what this is and what this isn't. And I think there's such a range of expectations and experiences out there right now, from families that thought this would be, a solid 5 hours of online instruction with a teacher live every hour for their child, to people who don't want, even 10 minutes of instruction and don't really want to engage in anything. And the other variable of this is just like when regular school is happening, not every teacher does things in the same way, and from school to school, that can look a little different. And so that's part of this too, is we've asked teachers to, start putting things together. It's not going to look the same from child to child. But what we do want to do is exactly what Mike said, is we want people to ask for help. We want them to contact their school, and people can help them start to frame things up if it does seem overwhelming, or if it seems like they're not getting enough. Either way, you're going to have feedback on both ends of the spectrum now as we keep moving forward. But we have 9 weeks or so left, and so we want to make sure that people are engaging as much as possible. Any other questions for Mike? Otherwise, we'll move on to the next piece, which is waivers.
Yes, so I just wanted to relay the demands from my local homeschool principal for parent support. The Skyward password problem is still a problem. She changed the password on the 2nd of April, and today it wouldn't let her back in with that password. And as you can imagine, there was a delay in response from all of the support groups. But there is a piece of this that I'm not sure. There is a very important piece of this in terms of parents are now going to be much more engaged. And particularly for those of us who have, God help us, not just but 2 kids at the middle school level. Today, we got 14 emails, each of which was a page and a half long. And it was 3 p.m. by the time we got to the point where we knew what our kids were supposed to do this week. If there is any way whatsoever to minimize the number of touch points for a parent, to understand what we should be doing to help our kid, what the expectations are, just what to do. Let's be honest, a high school student isn't always the most motivated creature when spring has hit. And so anyway, there's significant room for improvement, and I will be passing along her list of demands by email.
I just want to add to that, Chris. Part of the intention of that one day of email is to give you the whole week and to be able just to say in one stop, this is what's expected. You can put it on the fridge, you can have it in a folder. The student experience is to go into Power School and see their calendar for the week and go in. But as a parent, to be able to look and say, okay, I noticed that this week in your science class you had these 3 things, then the student can say, yep, here's where I am. So I think we're finding is that there was some messaging around, do that Monday at noon. And I think what we need to say is by Monday at noon, you should have had the week's worth of content delivered. So families can, create a file, put it in a folder, print it out. But we also want to be careful, because we did hear from families during the field test and also from neighboring districts that the absence of information is just as hard, because then you're relying on your kids.
Yeah, we need information. But I guess my point was less that there's too much communicated. It's that in 14 classes, we received links to the homework in 9 different ways.
Yeah.
That's a little frustrating as a parent when you don't go to the same spot. We had, of the 14 emails, we had 7 classes to use OneNote. 2 of them had parent-guardian links to OneNote, 1 of which didn't work. And then we had the other 4 classes were 3 that posted to Power School, but nothing in 1. Anyway, the lack of consistency is killing a parent with kids in high school. Anyway, so I've communicated the frustration. I've no need to go any further.
No, and those are good things to know. You're not the only one with that experience. And I've been on a lot of staff meetings where teachers are talking about that. They're also at a significant disadvantage right now of just not being next door or in their team meetings in the same way. So we'll pass that on. We want people to be watching that. Siri had a question as well.
Yeah, thank you. So my question actually is, first I want to say thank you for that feedback. That survey sounds incredibly helpful, and being able to really sort of walk through how do you do this as an iterative process and get that feedback from those key components and be able to make those changes. So thank you. I think that's fabulous in the work that you're doing going forward. It helps make sure our instructional program maintains the strength and the integrity that we're looking for. So thank you very much for doing that. The one question that I did have, you mentioned some disaggregation And so my question was, will you be able to disaggregate this for students who are in special education and receiving services, or for our EL learners, or for students who are economically disadvantaged, just so we can start to see, is their experience different?
Yeah, and also response rates too. So that, that's another area we're going to look at is, we pushed out surveys to all the families, but we know not all responded, right? And so is even the access to the survey an issue. In fact, we had one parent who said, visually she wasn't able to access it on her phone and use her reader on her phone. So we're looking at how do we fix those types of issues. So accessibility, even the surveys, is a factor. But yes, and I think we mentioned last time too, a lot of our digital tools, we can pull disaggregated information. So Lexia and Dreambox, we can pull that out by free and reduced, so it can be tied to a student identifier. And that's leading to some really interesting information as well.
So just to build off your comment that the surveys are the challenge sometimes of getting the response, are you considering other methodologies in which to do it? Holding up a focus group meeting with families in that group that you're looking for to be able to do that through a Zoom, or just one-on-one interviewing with them just to ask?
Yeah, we'll talk about this in a little bit, but we are going to be collecting data on students that we haven't connected with. And then at that point, somebody's reaching out and calling a family, and that's where we can start to gather some of those pieces of information. And so, specific questions like access to technology, engagement of your student, is the work that's coming home making sense? Do you know how to access it? Those personal connections we're finding. And again, by being able to narrow it down to which students haven't we heard to, that allows us to make more personal connections than just a big broad survey. So we're thinking that a lot of those types of questions can go into those phone calls with families as people are reaching out to them.
Wonderful. It's that whole feedback and how this is as being a brand new method of delivery. That's such a key thing. I mean, it's how you pilot projects, right? So it's fabulous the work that's going into it. So thank you for all your attention to that and making sure all our students get served.
Question about sharing survey results on the website and email to families. Mark, I don't know that we are planning to share these just because these are informing right now our practice, and it's designed to be used to kind of keep shaping that as opposed to perceptual data that we would release as kind of an outcome survey, but we'll certainly talk about that and what might be helpful.
It just seemed that it might, one parent's experience is their one parent's experience. And if they see that a lot of folks are having the same thing, they're going to say, okay, it's just not just me. Or if they're seeing that a lot of folks are having a much better experience, they're going to think, okay, well, what am I doing wrong? How can I improve it? That's the only thing I was thinking of.
I think what might be maybe more usable when you frame it like that is if we kind of frame it to, if you're having problems or questions about this, here's the common answer, or some Q&A, or as we push information out, we've heard from parents that this was the problem or this was the challenge, so here's what the remedy is, if you will. We'll talk about that. I mean, I think if we just put it out there, it doesn't go into problem solving, and we're trying to use it to shape and to solve and to help it get better. And so I think we need to make sure we do both, not just inform and say, well, here's how it's going, but if you were in this category with many people that said this, here are 3 things you can do as a solution.
Yeah, I could see it being the kind of the launching pad question for the page, and then saying, okay, here's what we're seeing, and here's what we're going to try and do about it, and here's what you can do about it at home.
Yeah, yep, I think that's a good idea. Okay, I don't see any other questions, so let's move on with waivers.
So I think we shared last week or the week before, I can't remember, they're all blending together. The state board came out with new direction about waiver options, are calling them emergency waivers for seniors, knowing that we're in just a very different place right now, and that there will be access issues and personal things that are happening for some of our seniors that will prevent them from being able to complete coursework that's required for graduation. And so the new waiver process that was just finalized allows us to apply for individual waivers for an individual student. So this wouldn't be like a blanket, we want all of our seniors to fall under this. It would be a counselor knows of a specific student that would be served by waiving a specific graduation requirement. So for example, an and English 12 second semester, or even the second half of the second semester, that there are just some circumstances for that student that's going to keep them from graduating and they can't complete it. So that means that just about any core class could be potentially waived. There's a limit on the number of courses that can be waived in terms of they need to be courses that either the student was enrolled in or planning to finish, maybe through a credit recovery type option in the second semester. So, if the student needed to earn a quarter of a credit and they were going to do credit recovery this semester and they hadn't quite started it yet, they could do that. Or if they were enrolled in a class and they were passing it at the closure and they just can't finish it now, that would be another potential option. So again, this is unlike many of other waivers we've seen in the past. This would apply to classes like English or math or science that are required for graduation. Civics is another one a lot of our seniors are in. There are some strings, though, that we need to be paying attention to, and that includes we need to make sure that students were on track for graduation. So this can't be a student that was down 6 or 7 credits or 12 credits, and now all of a sudden they just want to waive all those classes. It would be they were on track at the time of graduation. They were either working to complete missing credits or they were completing their courses that were required. In addition, we need to make a good faith effort to help students try to earn that credit. So, you need to make sure they're aware of the remote learning opportunities, that they're enrolled in courses that they need for graduation. And we even are looking at, are there some courses maybe they don't need that could be dropped with a withdrawal grade that doesn't affect their GPA so they could focus on fewer classes. So we're looking at lots of different ways to try to start with the idea that if you can continue learning, that's in everybody's best interest. We want you to do that, but if the conditions are such you can't, and we've made every effort to try to help a student, then we could use the waiver. We do need to make sure students and families are made aware that that credit still is an option and it will still remain to be an option. And this will be an important one too, is that waiving some of these classes will get a student across the line for graduation, but colleges and universities aren't letting go of the course requirement to the same extent as they are some of their grades. Now, they have said that there may be some students that they know for whatever reason couldn't finish the 4 years of English. They might have 3 1/4 years or 3 3/4 years credit, and they can recognize that in some cases that will be something to overlook, but it's not quite as universal as the pass, no pass grading system that colleges and universities are looking at. So we want to make sure kids are going in informed. But as we were talking with our counselors last week, they're saying, yes, there are some kids that this will actually serve. It'll get them across the line because they're in really tough spots right now. So there is a formal process, application process, that we will need to use for that. We submit the application directly to the State Board of Education, and then I believe each week they review applications and post which ones have been approved by district. So it's not by individual student name, but they'll say, like Washington submitted 5 waivers, and then they notify us which ones were approved or not approved. In addition, as you know, we have a waiver option for students to waive up to 2 elective credits that were required for graduation based on a student's circumstances. So these aren't those core courses, but of the 24, they can waive 2 elective credits. And so again, some of our counselors are working with students to say, yeah, you were in an elective class, that's something that could be waived or even dropped so that you can focus on these others. And so for some students that was already in place, but some students this may be a benefit as well. So those are the 2 essential waiver options that exist for students right now. We are, as I mentioned, met with counselors, counseling leads, and principals last week. We're going to meet with our secondary principals again tomorrow to review this one more time. We're still looking for that online application from the state board. There's a draft version that I've seen, but the actual application itself seems to be buried or not posted yet. It was supposed to be up on the 15th. So we're continuing to make sure we have the latest on that as we move forward, and then we'll provide support for our counselors. Our counselors and principals are the ones that are making the primary contact with students on these and are aware of which students would most likely benefit, but also we'll make this information available to families as well. So if a counselor for some reason hasn't identified a student who would benefit, families would know about it.
Questions? Are you still?
Oh, that's it on waivers.
Okay, sorry. Go ahead, Mark. Oops, you're muted, Mark.
Hello. Quick question, Mike. each year we have that late graduation ceremony we do for a few kids.
Yeah.
To me, it's one of the most gratifying graduations I ever see. But anyway, that said, are those kids going to be able to still be, do they fall into the waiver category? Do they fall into the late category? How is that going to work out this year?
There may be a little of both. So some of them may fall under it because they were right on the edge of passing a class, but they were passing or they were in the process of making up credits. And so those would be kids who are on track to graduation. There will also be some kids that know, though, that they had to do some additional work over the summer. Maybe they were down 1 or 2 credits. So that wasn't part of what they were enrolled in. So they may have to do additional summer work. That would likely be remote learning credit recovery with the way we've delivered it in the past.
Okay.
So we'd be reaching out with them, and then, like you're saying, we would have a later promotion ceremony for them.
Okay, thank you.
Good question.
I have a question also on, do we have any idea from our school counselors at this point how many students might need this kind of a waiver?
Not yet. So as I mentioned, I was just talking with counseling leads. So that's not all of the counselors at the school.
Right.
They're pulling together tracking lists of all the seniors that are of concern and are starting to reach out to them. So they're waiting to hear about this, but then we should be able to pull that data from them once they know this is an option.
Okay, so maybe in another board meeting we could have an update?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions? Okay, thanks, Mike.
Okay, so there's some information around competency credit as well. WASDA came out with this recently. We do have some competency credit options for students in Lake Washington. So for example, for our world language, we have in our policy and procedures an opportunity for students who take the world language proficiency assessment to earn up to 4 credits of world language by passing a competency assessment. So that's an area where we already have that in place. And as I mentioned, counselors are looking at this too. For kids who have this, they can check off their world language requirement. What WASDA was pushing on more specifically, however, was the idea of competency credit for things like the Smarter Balanced Assessment, for an example. And some districts have done this where they award perhaps a quarter credit or a half credit for passing the Smarter Balanced Assessment. Or thinking about the next most advanced class. So for example, if I passed Algebra 2, does that basically verify that I'm proficient in Algebra 1 or geometry, and so I can show that I've been proficient and earn credit for that? So what WASDA is recommending is that districts look for options like this for some students. Now, I asked our counselors about this, and they said, there aren't many, but there are a few. And so they seem to think that this is an option that would be worth considering. The other thing we looked at is where do we actually have assessments or resources that we would feel confident enough that either that assessment or that next class would actually be sufficient to say, yes, a kid has demonstrated proficiency and should earn credit. And really the only 2 areas we see right now would be ELA and math. Math primarily because of the sequential nature of the course, or courses in math, and in ELA because, and both Smarter Balanced because they are really closely tied to the content of the courses, specifically in 9th and 10th grade. So one thing to consider, and again, this would have to be something that the board would consider and discuss and approve or not approve, is the option of a narrow, limited policy and perhaps a time-bound policy for seniors that would allow us to go in and say, yes, we have a senior who passed the math SBA, but didn't pass 10th grade algebra. Would this be a way to allow them to earn credit? Partly because there aren't a lot of options for them right now otherwise. Similarly, they're enrolled in Alg 2, they're earning a passing grade in that, but didn't pass Alg 1. Could they receive proficiency credit and have that graduation requirement checked off? So part of what we wanted to check on tonight was just the level of interest in the board. We could come forward with a recommendation and some sample policy to read. In addition, WASDA recommends that if it is something the board's considering, they go right to a second reading so that there is time for this to actually play out and for counselors to start going through student records and seeing who this might apply to, reaching out to families and getting this all done within the next month and a half or so. So that's where we are on there. I think just based on what I heard from counselors, it's worth considering. And as I mentioned, we could come in with a situation recommendation and a sample policy to review at an upcoming board meeting if that's an interest.
So Mike, let me make sure I understand what we're talking about here. The idea would be for this year's seniors who might be lacking a credit to provide an opportunity to fill in that blank if they had passed through one of these proposed examples. If that's, and I see you nodding, so I'm going to take that for a yes. I'm a little hesitant about this, but at the same time, I just need to know more about what are how many kids have we got in this circumstance, and how the heck did they get there?
Yeah.
Is something that I need to understand.
Yeah, counselors mentioned it might be 1 or 2 students at a school, so very small number. Because if you think about it, a student who met standard on the Smarter Balanced assessment probably also passed algebra, right? I mean, on the flip side of that, there might have been a student who met standard who didn't pass algebra, and they were going to either have to do it as a summer option or a credit recovery option. So these are kids that just have these things hanging on their transcript somewhere that are graduation requirements that are unmet in ELA or math, but they have passed the state assessment, or they have passed a higher class in the sequence. Again, 1 or 2 kids maybe at a school, but the counselor said, yep, I have a kid just like that. Passed SBA, but we're trying to get them that algebra credit, and there's just no opportunity right now because we're shut down.
Right, and that's, so I guess I grasp this for math, is the ELA where they're supposed to have 4 years of ELA, and this basically means they've failed 1 term of ELA, and we'd be letting them through if they had passed an SBA that year. Is that?
Correct.
Okay.
But again, it's probably only for those 9th and 10th grade classes because the Smarter Balanced assessment really is only through a 10th grade level. So it's a very narrow range. The question is, and again, if it's time bound, if it gets a few kids across the line that might not have otherwise, or might have otherwise taken advantage of other options when school was open, like a credit recovery, a completion of a course, but they can't quite get to that right now. This is a way to open that up for them.
Okay. Well, I'd like to learn more.
Other questions for Mike?
Eric here. I'd like to hear more too, but I would like to see that in conjunction with the proposed policy from staff. I mean, I think this is something we're going to do. We have to move quickly to adopt it.
That's true.
So we could bring the policy language as well as some specific case studies of actual students and how this is actually helping them.
Yeah, that would be very helpful. Thank you.
We're going to plan to have that, I think, at next board meeting.
Thank you. This is Siri. The other thing that I would ask is just assuring it aligns with the standards we already, as I'm sure you're doing, but would appreciate just being able that we look at those sorts of things as well as the policy comes forward. I appreciate this being considered. This is sort of a unique time, and it's time to really sort of think through what are other ways we can look at competency or mastery-based learning. So.
Okay, so all the hot topics right now, grading and reporting. So we're looking at a kind of a 2-pronged and maybe even 3-pronged approach. At the elementary level, we're looking at teachers reporting and indicating which content areas have been taught. So as you know, on the elementary report card, there are content areas that are identified, and typically kids are getting a standards-based grade of 1 to 4. Just knowing that kids are in very different places and teachers are in very different places right now, teachers can indicate, yes, this was part of our remote learning instruction. I can verify that I've reviewed it. And then we're also looking at teachers indicating students that have submitted work or artifacts of learning or demonstrated learning in some way that a teacher would also note that. So there'd be kind of a 2-tier, 2-mark approach. Taught it, and I have some evidence of student learning. As far as though getting into the quality and whether it's a level 4 or a level 1, we just don't think, particularly at the elementary level, and just based on what we've been hearing from neighboring districts and OSPI, that that's the right approach right now. We know that we're going to have data on our student performance, and so when kids come back to school, we're looking at screening tools for math and for literacy, having some assessments that teachers are doing early on so we can see where there are gaps. But in terms of what we're reporting to families and just the pressure that kids feel whenever there's anything on a grade report, and that an elementary credit is not required, there are not credit-bearing options, we're just hearing overwhelmingly that this is the approach for elementary. It's secondary, a little bit different, particularly as we move into courses that are credit-bearing for high school. And so even in middle school, as you know, we have algebra, geometry, and world language courses that are credit-bearing. And so for those, we're thinking that it makes sense to have teachers continue to grade assignments and grade work, but then ultimately at the end of the semester, they're going to look into their grade book and say, okay, if a student has earned a grade that's high enough to pass, then it goes on the grade report and on the transcript for high school level as a P, or pass. If the student hasn't worked sufficiently and demonstrated enough proficiency of the remaining standards for the year and combined with their first quarter grades, then they would get an N or a no credit. At the middle school level, for non-high school credit-bearing courses, again, it's just a PN, but at the high school level, that P also earns credit towards high school graduation requirements, college entrance, things like that. Most of our colleges and universities, and in fact, Washington State colleges and universities, public colleges and universities just announced that for courses in the spring of 2020, pass no credit they will not be penalizing students for that. It won't hurt their admission opportunities. And colleges and universities across the country are kind of falling in line with that, though not all. The other question that's come up, though, is because teachers are putting grades in, and the reason we're doing that is because that's a system that they know and are familiar with, so they can assign grades to work, and it's easy to convert to a pass, no credit, as opposed to, I say for every single assignment, it's a pass or a no credit, and then do I, at the end of the quarter, say, well, I have 50% of the assignments got a pass, so that's a pass, or it's 60%. It was really ambiguous as opposed to a grading system where you could set a percentage cutoff to earn a pass. Knowing that students will have grades in Skyward that will be converted to a pass or no pass, the question is, should there be an option for students to request to have the letter grade that was assigned, that they have earned, appear on a transcript in place of the pass or no credit? So we default pass, no credit, but you could say at the end of the semester, I really would like that A on my transcript and calculate it into my GPA. You submit an application for that, and then it goes on your transcript. The questions that have come up about that is who benefits from that and who doesn't. What happens when you can't get a hold of a family or a family's not aware of that? Are we disadvantaging some students by not giving them a letter grade? So there's a number of equity issues related to this. At the same time, as I mentioned when we did our family survey, I think it was about 67% of families, maybe even a little bit higher, said that they preferred this option or strongly preferred to have this option at the end of the semester for their kids. And we know for some kids it's that motivator, it's that little bit of extra that they have, but we're also being careful that for some kids, the idea of a grade right now is just that one additional stressor, and so we're having to walk that real fine line too. So, as Mark mentioned, we were supposed to get OSPI guidance, and actually it was supposed to be initially Tuesday of last week, then we heard Friday, then Chris Reichdahl was on a webinar and said, well, I think I just really need to get input for people, so please email me your input, and then we'll use that as we're moving forward. So we're still waiting to hear. I'm thinking they're really trying to get community engagement and really understand the issue from a lot of perspectives. But we want to be careful that we don't go too far out in front and then have OSPI provide kind of counter guidance and then have other districts that are doing different things, and we just are in a real bind. So for now, we think we're okay moving ahead, having teachers collect and grade work. We said start slowly. And then we can come in with a final recommendation and guidance once we have that OSPI guidance to say, yep, pass no credit makes the most sense, or pass no credit with an option to request a grade makes a lot of sense or doesn't make a lot of sense. But we do want to be careful. As you know, we've been stung before, and districts have been stung before by going out too far in front of that guidance and then having to pull things back and the confusion that creates. So that's where we are currently. Ideally, we get that sooner than later so we can start working on that.
Mark had a question, and I think right now, Mark, I would just respond. He asks, is pass A through D or A through C? And we don't know yet. We're still working on the qualifiers for those things. Mike, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at just credit bearing, and if that's one of our main interests, then a D or higher is credit bearing for high school graduation. This is one of the challenges of not having those gradations, though, is you don't have that, well, at what level is that pass? There are a few districts, and there was an article that was out, and some districts are jumping on this. They're doing an A for everybody, or a no pass, which is interesting as well. There were some interesting equity conversations around that. So.
No, I sure was a surprise attack in a college class that it was an A through C, and I all of a sudden had to scramble it to last.
Yeah, and actually many of the colleges we're reading about, they are kind of debating that. Is a C really where the cutoff should be at the college level? At high school level, we're thinking it's probably not, particularly for credit-bearing courses.
Okay, just thought I'd ask. Thanks.
Okay, any other questions for Mike? This is probably the most complex area right now that we're still kind of wrestling with as a state and as a district.
No questions. I just want to say thanks, Mike. You are wrestling with some really significant things here, so it's very complicated, and I appreciate your thoughtfulness.
Thanks.
And
Okay.
appreciate the maintaining the flexibility so that all options are still available based on how it's happening.
Yeah.
All right, the last one for tonight is attendance. We're actually referring to this as connection as opposed to attendance, but we're going to be tracking in our attendance system. So we know that we've had families that we have had difficulties connecting with, whether it's through our student learning management systems, direct connections, for a number of reasons. And as you heard last week during the school reports, some schools have been doing, like, every family is confirmed to call. Other schools are in different places. Some schools are tracking in spreadsheets. Some schools are tracking with different forms that they use. And so as we shared last week, we need a consistent way of gathering that information across the whole district that can still be useful at the school level. What we've landed on is using our Skyward attendance system to have our teachers at the end of the week indicate which students and families have they not connected with. And right now to start, we're starting that not connection with a very broad set of indicators. So that might be you haven't heard from a student or a family despite reaching out to them via email. They haven't responded and you haven't received any communication from them. They haven't logged on to PowerSchool or OneNote. They haven't logged into one of our curriculum tools. There's just been zero contact in any way with the family. And we're starting with that just to prioritize those families that we haven't heard from that need to be engaged sooner than later. Then as a second tier, we're starting to talk about then what would then the next level be? So the family that's just barely showing up, or the family that you've heard from but the student really isn't engaged, what would be some indicators we could use for that? And then start thinking about how would we enter that? And so there are some additional fields in Skyward where you can indicate and provide some more narrative types of descriptive statements. But ultimately what this is going to give us is for all 30,000 of our students, we'll know, have we had some kind of contact, and then ultimately we can start working on the quality of that contact so we can start reaching out. What we're hearing from our field test teachers and schools that have been doing this a little bit longer is those personal connections. Just a little bit is sometimes all it takes. Like, hey, did you know we're fully online now, and here's how you can get to things. That gets a student over the hurdle. Or a family or a student that was reluctant and they're feeling like, gosh, if I go in now, am I going to get in trouble? Teacher contacts them and said, nope, everything's fine. We want you here. They re-engage. So you just start reaching out and connecting and pulling those students and families in. And then ultimately you are starting to get closer to those attendance rates that we've seen when students are in school. So we should have this, our goal would be to do the first round of recording this Friday. We're finalizing the guidance and documents for this tonight and tomorrow with our principals, and then we'll get that out to teachers so they can start tracking more effectively. And then we will also be providing these reports, and they're printable by school. So like Lucy Davis was sharing last week, she can pull up a similar report just like this, pull out the families that haven't been contacted, and they can start working at the building level to reach out. And that's it for the tracking system, and that's it for the full presentation too.
It's a lot. Thank you, Mike.
And I don't know if Matt Gillingham, if there was anything that maybe I missed on that one.
I think one of the benefits that by tracking this in Skyward is we'll be able to disaggregate by some population demographics and to be able to see Are there schools that are having a larger percentage of students that are they're not connecting with, and therefore we need to think about the level of support that a school, the school staff might need in order to help be able to reach out to their students? Or if we look at if there's any commonalities in terms of whether it's by language or some other characteristic in which what we can do as a district staff, where we can provide additional and intentional levels of support to help ensure that we're creating opportunities for our students to engage. So right now what we're getting back is fairly kind of broad, the percentages of students that are being engaged, but we'll be able to actually tailor that a bit more. So not only will schools be able to reach out and identify their individual students who are they're not having contact with, but that we'll be able to say, think about a population level and figure out what types of supports might need to engage in order to bridge that gap.
All right, thank you to both of you. We have a lot going on, and we're going to continue to learn. We appreciate the feedback, both as your experience as a parent and as a board member, so that we can keep heading in the right direction. It seems relatively simple, and when you begin to explore the complexities and the problems that we need to solve, there's a lot there with a lot of people trying to do their level best and keep things moving ahead. So we appreciate the updates. Anything else? Otherwise, I will turn it back to you, President Bleasner.
All right. Well, with that, thank you very much for that update as to where we're at. It's exciting that it began, and the amount of work and efforts in which to be able to serve every student is laudable, I think is the word I would use. So thank you very much for your time and attention to all those, and look forward to the continued work going forward. Crisis brings up lots of opportunities as well. So it's exciting to see things, we'll make some leaps in technology that we wouldn't have made for years because of this work going on. So thank you for being very thoughtful in that process and making sure all our stakeholders are engaged. And the next item with us on our board agenda this evening is any additional comments. Does any board member have any comments?
On this or on anything else?
On anything you would like.
I would just like to, since it is still School Library Month, I would like to thank our librarians and library staff for a little bit of a shift in their daily duties. They're doing a lot of tech support for teachers as we roll out these new options and really get kids engaged with the online learning. And I think that is worth recognizing and thanking them for.
Thank you very much. That's great. Any other board member comments?
Eric here. Sorry, everyone. I have a toddler screaming about 8 feet away from me, so I'll be brief. I just wanted to say that as part of our consent agenda tonight, the board approved entering into a contract with Dr. John Holman to be our next superintendent. And I just want to say that I'm personally very excited to see what John is able to accomplish in that role.
All right, thank you very much. That is yet again another piece of the work that has been going on through this time frame. Anything else? All right, hearing no other board member comments, I'd just like to give an update as to what our next board meetings are. Our next one will be May 4th. It will still be virtual at 5 p.m. And then we'll have another one on May 18th. So some of these items, we'll have an update of this, as well as we'll start working through some of the monitoring reports and start to process through some of the typical work that the board is doing on a regular basis. The next step we have on our agenda is an executive session. And so we will now convene into that executive session for 60 minutes for the purpose to review the performance of a public employee. The board will reconvene at 7:20, and when we do reconvene, there is no board action that will be taken. And so with that, we will now convene into executive session. Thank you.
And I would just like to remind everyone to leave this and enter into that meeting. virtually as well.